Hello, my name is Taylor Mitchell. For my project, I decided to discuss the stop and frisk policy. I chose to do my presentation on this topic because of the debate on whether the stop and frisk policy was constitutional or unconstitutional. Another argument is often discussed regarding the stop and frisk policy is that the policy has been considered to be racially motivated. In fact, during the years 2002 to 2019, 5 million stops were conducted, and out of those 5 million, only 10% were Caucasian individuals. There is certain procedure that law enforcement officers are supposed to follow before they decide to initiate a stop and frisk. One of the first things officers are expected to have is reasonable suspicion before they are allowed to implement a stop and frisk. What this means is that the officer believes that an individual they have deemed a suspicious character has committed a crime, is going to commit a crime, or is in the process of committing a crime. Officers are expected to use their discretion to determine if a person is suspicious, although this cannot be without certain bias. Despite the presence of bias, there has been cases where the court found a stop and frisk to be performed correctly. One of those examples would be the Terry v. Ohio case. Officer McFadden was patrolling downtown Cleveland, where he was hired to disband the crime that was transpiring in the area. While he was observing the people who were just passing by, two people happened to grab McFadden's attention. He observed the two individuals for quite a long time to try to determine that he had acquired reasonable suspicion. He saw the two individuals as they appeared to be scoping out the different department stores. They would walk by the store and then, after a moment, walk back to their original location. They did this multiple times, when all of a sudden another person eventually appeared and talked to them before they continued on their way. McFadden continued to watch the individuals as they proceeded to scope out the building. As the two men turned to walk in the direction of the third individual, McFadden proceeded to follow them. Then he was joined with the third individual who they were previously talking to. McFadden stopped the men to question them, and after considering their inability to answer his questions, he decided to perform a stop and frisk, for the safety of the community, but also for his own safety as well. As a result, McFadden discovered the three individuals had concealed weapons on their person, and most likely prevented a future crime from taking place. McFadden had reasonable suspicion and performed the procedure correctly. However, in certain cases, this procedure has been used as a platform against individuals of diverse ethnicities, which led to an unfortunate turn of events. One example of this would be when they performed a stop and frisk policy on an individual known as Patrick Dorsman. Patrick was an African American individual who worked as a security guard until he was shot and killed during a stop and frisk gone wrong. Patrick was found to be unarmed during the time of his death. The stop and frisk can usually result in incidents like this happening simply because officers do not know how to perform a stop and frisk correctly, and because they are expected to use their discretion on what makes a person suspicious. Knowing this information, is the effectiveness of a stop and frisk really worth the possibility of losing a human life? To determine the effectiveness of a stop and frisk, we can look at the NYPD database for this information regarding the stop and frisk policy. One thing that was automatically considered to be a problem with the data was how the different precincts conducted a different amount of stop and frisk within their area. However, this did not stop researchers from trying to figure out how effective the stop and frisk policy was. They compiled all the data they could from the different precincts and categorized them into different forms of data, such as pooled and cross-lagged. The pooled data was analyzed to figure out if there was a correlation between the number of stops and the number of robberies and assaults within an area. The cross-lag data was used to compare the different precincts' data from one another. One advantage to this data set was how large the sample size was. This allowed the research to have a better way to identify the relationships between certain components, like stop and frisk and assaults. Using this data, they ran 21 different tests to try to determine the effectiveness of the stop and frisk. However, after conducting the tests, they found that only 5 of them showed any sort of effectiveness out of the 21 tests. They also discovered from this data that the change in crime rate had nothing to do with the amount of stops and frisks performed. The information gathered seemed to imply that whenever a crime rate would increase, they would just perform more stops and frisks in that area. and when the crime rate would decrease, they would just decrease the amount of stop and frisk they would perform. There is no data showing that the reason the crime rate lowered was because of the stop and frisk that were performed. If there is one thing that can be taken away from this information, it is that stop and frisk policy has no major effect on crime rate. The purpose of this policy was to prevent and deter crime from happening. However, considering the data provided by the NYPD, one thing can be determined from this policy. The data provided that the stop and frisk were relatively ineffective, not to mention that these stops are not worth the potential cause of an innocent death or a violation of individuals' civilian rights. Perhaps if law enforcement officers were better trained on the stop and frisk policy, it would be more effective, and then maybe people would not have to question if their constitutional rights were in violation.